Hi, everyone. I am Kate Drabinski. I'm here for today's webinar on how to do meaningful community-engaged scholarship and teaching. I'm so glad you could join us. And the way this webinar will go is in a minute I will disappear from the screen and I'll pull up our slides for the day. And while I'm going through the slides, I won't be able to see anything that you write in this part of your screen, but I'll be able to see it when I return. So the webinar should last 30 or so minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion if you have questions or insights. And I see from some of the people who are attending that you all have experience in this, so it would be interesting to hear your ideas. So now I will disappear and pull up the slides, and I'll be back here soon. All right. Hopefully this will work. All right, it's being a little bit annoying. So let's see. Hold on. Okay, so here we go. All right, so this is a webinar again on how to do meaningful community engaged scholarship and teaching. I think a lot of us are being called upon to do this increasingly, but there are a lot of logistical and ethical and intellectual questions that arise. So this is just a brief talk about some things we've learned here I teach at UMBC, and some things I've learned also from doing service learning and community engaged teaching at Tulane University in New Orleans, another place where there were a lot of ethical and logistical issues. So that's what we're talking about today. More specifically, I'm going to start by talking about how we define community engaged teaching and research. And this is something that is, I think, very institutionally dependent, because a lot of places have ideas about what counts, but we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I want to spend some time discussing the institutional and personal pitfalls that can come with doing community engaged teaching and research. I think it can be incredibly rewarding, but it's also incredibly time consuming. And so it's worth pausing to think about what that means for your work life and your career. Then we'll move on to talk about, well, what if you decide to do it? To do community engaged teaching and research, what are some ways that it can that you can organize it so that it is successful and rewarding? Then we'll talk about making community connections. This, I think, is one of the biggest issues with community engaged teaching and research. It's where the most it's where those partnerships are incredibly valuable, and they're very and they take a lot of work to organize, maintain, and sustain. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about sustaining the work over time. The academic calendar is not always the best for doing sustained projects. So we'll talk about some strategies for how to do that. And then we'll discuss how to wrap up projects, how to finish something. Is it okay to sort of end a community partnership and move on? And how do you do that? So, and then we'll end with some final resources from Ideas on Fire. We have a lot of scholars who do this kind of work who we've talked to, and we have a lot of resources. So that's where we'll end today. But first, let's define community engaged teaching and research. In terms of teaching, institutions have different ways they understand this. I think the most common understanding is service learning. And service learning is about connecting course content with some kind of service activity, usually outside of the university, and being in what I say later in the slide, the kind of constant action and reflection cycle. So you're doing the sort of book learning in class, and then you're going into the community, and your whatever community that happens to be, and you're doing some kind of service project that brings that to life. In feminist studies programs, this is incredibly common to do a feminist theory course and at the same time do an internship, for example, at Planned Parenthood, and then reflect on the difference between doing work in the classroom and doing work outside of the classroom. Service learning is, a lot of schools have centers of service learning, and you can get a lot of support sometimes for these kinds of projects. Another model is a little different from service learning, and I call it here models of community engagement. And rather than thinking about community engaged teaching as connecting students to service opportunities, the question is how, like, is sort of starting sometimes with the community partner and seeing what they need and meeting it with what you and your students can possibly do. So it sort of is a little bit critical of the model of service learning and the idea that that service is the best way to enact social change from the academy. That model is sometimes experienced by students, teachers, and community partners as sometimes a one-way conduit from the university to the community. Good service learning programs aren't like that, but it is something that you've sort of got to always be aware of. Community engagement or social change models, I think, are a little bit different, and their focus comes from somewhere else. In both, though, I think you've got an action reflection cycle with students, and also this idea of theory and practice, and that kind of how praxis works, how what we learn from our reading can be applied in the outside world. Now, some models will do this kind of community engagement with the university itself, make that the community. That's one way that in some of my courses, I deal with some of the challenges that we're going to talk about later. But if you're thinking about doing community engaged teaching, it's important to have a very broad sense of what community means and to realize that students are already in a community, and that can be a place where they can do some of that learning. But that's when people are talking about community engaged teaching, they're generally talking about connecting students with outside community partners in a service model. In terms of community engaged research, this often pairs well with teaching, right? I'll often do work with students in the community about something that I'm already working on in my research. And I think this is true for lots of us. And in research, it's really about collaboration between the researcher and community partners. It's about collaboration between different researchers who are working on similar projects, right? It's really about working with and sustaining long-term relationships with community partners. And this work often has a social justice goal. And I think it's important to stay flexible about what those goals are as the project and program continues. And combining the research and teaching, I think, is a good way to get through some of the more challenging scheduling and logistical issues that come up with this kind of work. So let's talk about some of the pitfalls of community engaged teaching and learning. And these are partly things that anybody who does this kind of work is intimately familiar with, but what our chairs and deans and administrators are not familiar with. They don't necessarily understand the real institutional risks that we take when we do this work. The university will often be the first to trumpet our amazing results and the fantastic projects our students do with their community partners, but there's some real issues. The first issue is time. Teaching with a community engagement part of the course is very time consuming. It's like teaching a second class that's adjuncted to your first one. So that takes a lot of time. Also, if you've got a lot of, if your community site is outside of your university, getting students and yourself to and from the site can take a lot of time, right? So these things they seem so small, but they are actually really important to think ahead about, right? How much time is this gonna take? The other issue, if you happen to be on the tenure track, which I know some of you are, but a lot of us are not, but if you are, the time that it takes to do this work and the sort of time it can take to do research, community engaged research, can sometimes be outside of the time expectations of tenure, right? So if you've got to write a book for tenure, starting a new project with a community partner, then that project is just going to take more time because you've got more people's timelines to work with, can really ding the other kinds of work you have to do to get tenure. So that's something to think about and to talk really openly and frankly with your chair in your department before you undertake this work, just because some places tenure processes will not recognize the kind of work that you're doing, even if it's very important and the institution tells you it is. The third thing to think about is the resources that are necessary to do really good community engaged teaching. And when I say resources, I mean time, of course, but I also mean very practical things like access to recording equipment. If you're doing a kind of project that requires interviews or oral histories with folks. Transportation is, I think, one of the biggest resource issues. For example, I would really like to work on a project. I teach at UMBC. I'd really like to start a project with a community partner in East Baltimore. That's maybe 6 or 7 miles from campus, but to get a bus to take me and students there and back costs over $400 a trip, right? So when institutions don't put resources towards those logistics, that can be really challenging. So think about the resources that you really practically need to do this work. And I think it's important to see if you have access to those resources. And then with all of these institutional pitfalls, I think you've got to ask yourself, when is it worth it? So for a lot of us, doing research and teaching is valuable insofar as it helps change the world, right? That's, for a lot of us, that is one of our values. So sometimes these institutional pitfalls, the teaching an extra class, having to deal with constant applications for money to keep the work going, these can be stumbling blocks, but for a lot of us, if the project is worth it, it's worth moving forward. So that's a really personal question to ask yourself, but think about when it's worth it. Now, in terms of personal pitfalls, and these are slightly different from institutional pitfalls, to do sort of a strong community engaged research or teaching, I think it's really vitally important to have an ongoing relationship with community partners, right? Rather than a service learning model that drops students in for 10 weeks and then takes them out, and how much can be accomplished in that time, right? So that can be actually more work for a community partner than if you never offered any help at all. So when you're starting these projects, think ahead about how you're committing to long-term engagement. Doesn't mean you have to do it forever and work with the same community partners forever, but if we're being honest about the kind of ethical issues in this work, I think starting from a place of long-term engagement, unless your community partner just needs help with a one-off thing, starting from an expectation of long-term engagement is really important. Also, remember that that collaborating with people inside the university is incredibly challenging for a lot of us with different priorities and goals. And when you add in partners from outside the university, you can be operating in completely different worlds. So this is, again, not something to keep one from doing it, but it's something to keep in mind when you're deciding to go down this road, right? That there are real challenges to collaboration. Are you the kind of person who can work through those challenges? I'm collaborating with a community partner right now, and I realize I'm learning a lot about myself, about how hard it is for me to, she talks on the phone, I talk by email. We had to work out how that was going to go, right? So it's kind of very small things. They're real challenges to collaboration. The third thing I wrote here is about contingency and community engagement. And by this, I mean, a lot of us are not on the tenure track, and we're in contingent positions, and we may only be in a place for a year or two, or even if we're here for a long time, it's on contracts that aren't necessarily going to be renewed. It's really important to think about one's own structural position before deciding to do this work. Will this, and this is, again, not a reason not to do it, but it's a reason to think, like, before I make this choice, right, how is this going to affect what I can do with the rest of my time and career, right? Is it worth putting in the effort to build this relationship with a community partner if I'm going to have to leave next year? Now, sometimes it is, but sort of think about your goal, your long-term goals, as well as your short-term ones here, especially if you're contingent faculty and you're trying to figure out what the rest of your career is going to look like. So again, it's really about thinking, is it worth it to me? What are my values, and how do I arrange my work life to live my values, while also understanding that I work within structural constraints that can make that work incredibly difficult and sometimes take away some of what's rewarding about it. So just wanted to start with a few, like, hey, watch out, this work can be really hard, but it can also be some of the best work you do. So once you decide to do community engaged teaching and research, you've got to think about all of the issues that come up right away. And the first thing that I put on this list is to identify community partners. Who do you want to work with? And how you do this sort of depends on where you're coming from. So, for example, I'm part of a community LGBT history committee. And so I'm already on that committee. I've been working with them for years. If I decide to do, I decided to do a research, like community engaged research with a queer theory class, and I was able to connect them with the community partners I was working with on those issues, right? So if you're already working with a group, that can be a really good connection. If you're new to a place, it can be a bit harder, right? You've got to do some of the legwork to go out and find groups that you think might share your values, but also who you think your students could or your research could feasibly actually help. And some places to start this work, I think talking to colleagues who've done community engaged teaching or research can be really helpful. If you have a service learning group on campus, that's like a center, that's a great place to go. You can get a sense of, because those service learning centers generally have been working on relationships for years and years and years and have ongoing relationships. And they will often have a lot of good ideas for possible community partners, but then also can help facilitate that. It'd be interesting for those of you watching the webinar who have done this work to hear from you a bit about how you identify community partners, because that can be really tricky. The next thing that is super important to do is to identify campus resources. A lot of campuses have a lot of resources, and it's just about finding them. So, for example, if you're doing a service or you're doing a community engaged teaching with a single class and you have that transportation issue, sometimes service learning centers will have vans that they can lend you, right? Or you can organize something through them. Student life is a good place to look for resources that can help you get students off campus and to sites where they might do this research. So figuring out where your campus resources is really important. Also, if you've got a dean's office that puts out information about how important community engagement and social justice are on this campus, if that's sort of the line, and it depends on where you are in the power hierarchy, but asking them to put some money behind that when you've got a plan can often actually work, because the work of community engaged scholarship and teaching is much, much harder than talking about how great it is. And so sometimes there's pockets of money on campus that can help you do that work, because people want it done, but often don't want to do it. Next, I suggest building support networks with other people doing community engaged scholarship and teaching on your campus. And so across departments, people who do service learning, people who are working on research in whatever city you're in, that kind of support network helps with identifying community partners and campus resources. It also gives you a nice group of people you can bounce ideas off of when you're really stuck. I know that I'm teaching a class this summer, and I was like, I'm struggling with this one community partner and how to do this, and having some colleagues to talk through that with has been really helpful. So build support networks with people who do similar work. Next, communicate with your chair or whoever is your direct report. I think it's important that they know what work you're doing. This can do something towards that issue of tenure and promotion when you decide to do community engaged teaching and research, but also things can go wrong, and it's good to have folks on your side before you start who can help you when that happens. So having an open line of communication with other people you work with and who you report to is super important. Next, once you decide to do this work, it's worth thinking for a little bit about dissemination. How are you going to get, because part of what makes community engaged teaching and research so valuable is that it actually produces stuff that's good for people, right? Or that helps change things. So think about how you're going to disseminate your research and how students can disseminate the results of their teaching. So this is a conversation that should definitely be had with your community partner. What kind of deliverables are they expecting? But then also for yourself, thinking about how to promote this work. I think that's important for being able to create sustainable projects. And it also is a way to showcase and to spread the word about the kind of work that can be done. And that can be really inspiring for other faculty members, and it can grow your community. So think about how you want to disseminate your teaching and research products. And then finally, when you decide to do it, think about the ethical issues that are involved. And I think these are very important to consider, both in terms of yourself and your needs, but also your community partners with this research and teaching work. Think about time. How much time can you commit to the project? How much time can you expect students to commit? And how much time does the community partner need? So one of the issues with service learning, and this came up a lot when I was working at Tulane, was that we had a mandate to place every student in a service position. And it was a city, not long after the levees broke, with a lot of scrambling folks and scrambling nonprofits that just didn't have the capacity to take on that many students. So when working with community partners, think about how much time you're asking from them to help you train your students or do your research. Right? So this is one of the ethical issues with working with others. There's also the ethical issue of money. If you are asking, say, community partners to come to your class and help teach, right, or give a walking tour of a neighborhood, or share their insights at a meeting with your students, you've got to figure out a way to pay them. I think this is really an important ethical issue. Some speakers, I think, don't need to be paid because they're coming for some other reason. If I go guest teach a class, I don't expect that faculty member to pay me. But when you're asking community partners to do work for you, it's really important that they be paid for their labor. So figuring out where that money can come from is very important. And then finally, think about ownership over the product of the work, the teaching or the research work that you do. Are you working on something that will belong to the community partner? Is it something that will belong to you? Is it something students will continue to have access to? So another example, this summer I'm teaching a community engaged class where students are building a website based on an archival special collection. And the website they build is going to belong to the special collection. It's not going to belong to the students. And yet they'll still have access to it as a thing to showcase something that they've done, something that they've made, but consider sort of who's going to own your work product. And it's, I think, an important ethical question. So just a few things to keep in mind once you decide to do it. Right, so I want to talk a little bit about making community connections. I think the most important thing is to realize that it takes time to make real, strong, authentic, long-term community connections. You don't always need to, right? I mean, you might have a community partner who reaches out to you and says, we need help doing, building this kind of a website or something like that. Do you have students who can help? And that might be a one-off project idea. But if for long-term research and also for long-term teaching projects, take your time. You don't have to, not everybody's going to be a good fit with each other. So it's worth spending some time to make sure that's true. Also, when you're making community connections, I think the most important thing is to listen. As they say, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and so you should spend twice as much time listening. I think that a lot of times academics feel like they know what other people need because we've read a lot about it, but we don't. So spending a lot of time listening to community partners is important to figure out, like, do you actually have what's necessary to help, right? And once you figure that out, you make a commitment, it's really important to follow through with that commitment, right? So if you tell a community partner that you will have students working, doing oral histories with their organization, that has to actually happen. Otherwise, you lose trust. You lose the trust of community partners. You lose the trust that you have with yourself about whether or not you can do this work, and students miss out as well. So that follow-through step is really important to maintain a community connection. In terms of how to make community connections, I think networking can be really important here. Most of us work on campuses with lots and lots of folks. Figuring out who's working in the area or might have a connection to someone in the community you'd like to work with, is really helpful. So network among the rest of your faculty and staff on campus. Next, I wrote here, tread lightly. And by that I mean it can be very easy to commit quickly and strongly to a project with a community partner because it's exciting. And it can be exciting to say, okay, I'm going to have this group of students who are all going to do this amazing work, and it's really going to be great. And it's really easy to overcommit and overpromise. So, but we've got to tread a little more lightly than that, right? Like, keep in mind that especially if you're teaching a larger class rather than something that's real small and focused on a single project, not all your students are going to have the same sense of engagement or sense that it's important, right? So you might be sending students to work with community partners, and those students aren't interested, right? And what are they going to do when they're there? And how are you going to keep your connection going if you've got some students who are not sort of tuned in, right? So thinking about what you can control and not control, and sort of being careful about what kind of commitments you make, thinking about what resources you have in terms of students and money and time is really important to making those connections. Also consider the timelines of students. Students are usually in your class for a semester or a quarter, and then they're gone. Community engaged projects don't necessarily happen on a semester timeline, but students do. So think about, one suggestion I have is to think about how to build projects over time so that subsequent classes can engage the same project, but move the whole project forward. This is, I think, especially helpful if it's your own research project. Students can really, they can do a small chunk of the research or a small chunk of the work, and then the next semester can pick up. The next semester students can pick up where they left off. So that can be a way to build projects with students who are temporarily there, but with community partners whose work is year-round, right? So that's one way to sort of deal with that. One issue that comes up with a lot of community-engaged research and teaching is how to sustain the work over time. Beware the one-time grant. This is an issue that many people on my campus have faced. You can get the one-time course redevelopment grant or service learning grant or whatever it is they call it on your campus, and then you spend the money like on honoraria for speakers and on a bus to get students to that walking tour in the city, but then the money's gone. And how do you redo it the next year? So that's something to really keep in mind when you see that one-time grant opportunity. So some ideas for for sustaining work is to find campus partners, and I suggest looking at your transit. If you have a transit center on campus, talk to them about how you might be able to get students from place to place. That can be a good campus partner. Service learning centers, again, really good campus partner. They often have long-standing relationships with community partners and can help you get in on those relationships or give you tips for how to build your own. Also, student life programs. often are focused on this kind of engagement, not in an academic sense, but in other ways, and they can have ideas for how to do this work. And then increasingly, deans and provost offices where the money is. At UMBC, where I teach, the kind of idea of social change through our through community engaged work is in the strategic plan, right? So we can go to that strategic plan and say, hey, you said this was important. Can I get some money to actually do this? And I'm not saying you're going to get the money necessarily, but it's worth asking, because those are the places that have money that's a bit more flexible. And then also, to sustain the work over time, super important to build a faculty community around this, to agitate for changes in tenure expectations. We recently did this on my campus, where we wrote something into the faculty handbook about how this work counts, because often community engaged teaching and research is seen as less rigorous, less important, less peer reviewed than other kinds of academic work. But if you've got a large community that can work together to make a compelling case, you can sometimes change some of the structural issues that make this work hard. And that includes getting resources for the work that match institutional ideologies, right? The idea that the institution should give back to the community in which it is located. How do you do that? Put some money into this kind of work. So having a faculty community to do that kind of organizing can be super helpful. But what about the project when it's finished? I think that I want to talk just briefly about this, because community engaged teaching and research, I think, is best done ethically when it's with a long-term partner that you've really developed a relationship with, a relationship of trust, right? But that doesn't mean that you have to work with the same group forever, right? So it's entirely possible that the work is short-term and you finished it up. Or if your research is moving on, right, how do you say that? So just a couple of ideas here. It's very important to maintain an open line of communication with community partners, where, again, you're doing a lot of the listening, but you're also being honest about what you can and can't do. That is very important to keep. And I know that for a lot of us, overpromising is just, and we want to be able to do those things. But if we can't, we need to be upfront and honest about that. So, and if it's time to end a project for whatever reason, communicate that and be direct with your community partners. Also, in terms of wrapping up projects, think about how the waves of students you've been working with, like when to stop that wave, right? So, and so this builds a little bit on this idea that you can build a project out over time with different groups of students working on different aspects of it, but sometimes you actually just need to close it up. So if that's the case, consider what I can't believe I use this management speak here on this slide, but consider your final deliverables. Like, what can you leave the community partner with that's helpful for them, right? If your students are working on a project to design a brochure for that small community museum or something like that, once that's, make sure that that thing gets done, but then that can be a natural stopping point. So sort of considering what the final things you want to put out there, and then finishing that up. And then last couple things about wrapping up projects. Sometimes projects wrap up because they failed in some way, because for a whole host of reasons. So I think doing one of the things that has kept me from doing community engaged teaching and research sometimes is the fear that I won't be able to do it in the ethical manner in which I think it should be done. But we're all going to make missteps in this work. It's just part of the show. So allowing some space for failures and for projects to end that didn't live up to expectations on your part, student part, community partner part, that's just part of how this work goes. And one thing that's helped me think through this is that while these ethical issues are important, it is also the case that it's often hard to do a whole lot of harm, right? So, and that sounds weird, but it can give you some distance between the sense that your failure is going to ruin something and like what's actually happening, which is that projects fail all the time inside and outside the academy. So it's okay for a project to end because it didn't work out. That's part of doing this work, and it's part of what makes it scary, but also really exciting. Finally, I think when you wrap up projects, communicate that to the people above you at the institution, whether that's your chair or a dean, and remind the institution what you did, because I think that puts you on their radar as somebody who does this kind of work who can be supported in the future. But also remind them what you couldn't do, right? So I have gotten very used to reminding folks that one of the reasons I can't do projects that I want to do is because of a lack of transportation. I know I've said that before, but it just really bothers me. The fact that I can't get students to a place without having a huge budget is really challenging. So reminding the institutions what you couldn't do because you lacked resources can be part of the argument for more resources. But I just wanted to just take a slide to stop and pause and say it's okay to end these projects. They don't have to continue in perpetuity. So finally, we have a bunch of resources from Ideas on Fire. This was a very brief discussion of some of the issues that pop up with community engaged teaching and research. So these links are all in the slides that are posted. We have a list of resources for public scholarship and public engagement. We have a great podcast with Sarah Bernstein, who does a lot of community engaged research, talking about doing critical public scholarship. We've got a webinar that's specifically about teaching. This is about pedagogy in the public sphere. And then finally, coming up in a couple weeks, we'll have a podcast with UMBC's Tanya Lizarazo, who has done some amazing service learning and community engaged teaching and research in Baltimore City. And she'll have some great practical tips on how to do this work with students in your communities. Right. So, and hopefully you've joined our newsletter so you can learn about upcoming webinars. All right, so that's today's webinar, if I can make this go away. And now I'm back. Hi. So I see someone has asked a question. All right, first a recommendation and then a question. One, oh, links aren't working. Okay, I will, hi Tanya, I will, that's strange. Let me see, hold on a second. All right, the link is working on my end, so, oh, but maybe it isn't. No, it's working on my end, so I'll look into that for a second. But first, from Sarah, I work in a sustainability office and manage a program supporting faculty to do community engaged learning. Great idea, another campus resource people may want to consider reaching out to. In that role, what are top supports that a campus partner like myself can do for you? Thank you for asking, Sarah. So does anybody have, and you can type them in the column here, ideas for how a campus partner like the Sustainability Office might help you? I can think of a couple ways. One, I have really appreciated, our sustainability department does a program in the summer where they take students to a farmer's market in the city. And I found that to be a really, to just know about this kind of projects to share with students, because for me, the community engaged teaching isn't just about the single community partner class, but it's also about just getting students off campus. And that has been really helpful. The other thing that that is helpful is if campus partners have ideas for faculty about things that they might help with. So for example, here at UMBC, our sustainability office worked with other campus partners to start a small garden on campus and then offered that as a project for other classes. So having ideas about how you can help, like project ideas, I think for some faculty can be really helpful. Great, and Tanya has this great idea of a list of community organizations and events with links and publications that can be included on syllabi. I think having that coming from the sustainability office here has been really helpful. The sustainability office here is also partnered with faculty to learn how to integrate sustainability questions into classes that aren't necessarily about the environment, and that's been helpful. So just a few things off the top of my head and Tanya Lizarazo's. Any other questions or ideas? I am sorry, Sarah, that the slides aren't working. Are they working for other folks if you click on the link? Well, regardless, I will have, when the email goes out to you all who registered, there'll be a link to the slides there as well. So thank you all for joining us today. And I think that was all the questions. Yep. So we will talk again at next month's webinar. Hope to see you there. Bye-bye.